the most dangerous man in America, a name once given to Daniel Ellsberg, an analyst who was seeking to expose the truth of the Vietnam War. Ellsberg released top-secret documents exposing decades of misleading information, creating a worldwide outburst. This is the 1971 Pentagon Papers scandal. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times published a shocking article detailing the repulsive truth encapsulated in the Pentagon study on the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Behind it all was Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who recognized the unjustified murder of the Vietnamese people and exposed decades of dishonesty regarding this ongoing conflict. The study held 7,000 pages of scandalous documents, all of which plundered the United States government's prestige and destroyed the American people's trust in political leadership. Although the New York Times faced backlash concerning national security, their actions were supported by the Constitution's First Amendment, freedom of the press. The scandal broke barriers within national accountability and transparency, which were formed from decades of secrets enclosed in past administrations. In 1967, Robert McNamara, the United States Secretary of Defense, commissioned the creation of a study of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Officially titled The Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, this report was created to reflect on the true decisions that prominent American figures made throughout the course of this conflict. Many of the secrets contained in this document contradicted what the American people thought to be true of the Vietnam War. The 7,000-page study contained 4,000 pages of documents and 3,000 pages of historical analysis of the conflict. The government-ordered examination was only known to exist by high-ranking government officials, such as Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was working for the Research and Development, or RAND Corporation, as a military analyst when he came to realize the harsh abuse of power the United States government committed in their connection to the war. To the American people, the war seemed to have little to no purpose. As the war raged on, many started to believe that the conflict was unwinnable and were beginning to lose faith in their government's decisions. In 1965, protesters began to take the streets, spreading the anti-war messages to all. By 1969, Daniel Ellsberg encountered the dreadful truth that was being kept from the American people and struggled with the decision to unshield the horrific actions made by the American government leaders. He struggled with mental barriers during this time with the decision of whether or not to release the papers. However, he eventually overcame them.
Ellsberg used his connections within the Department of Defense to get a hold of the Pentagon Papers and craft a plan to release them over a prolonged time period. He started slowly yet meticulously, copying the documents after hours at the RAND Corporation's Santa Monica office. Daniel Ellsberg and his team of other governmental hustlers who had a strong opposition to the war had a simple mission to release the truth of the Pentagon Papers to the public. Once attained, Daniel Ellsberg devised a plan to release the documents in the most public way possible. Ellsberg and his team used their connections to approach several members of Congress, none of which took action. In June of 1971, the team began serious efforts to contact reporters from major news companies, their way of spreading the truth the most effectively. While working for MIT's Center for International Studies as a senior research associate, Ellsberg gave portions of the study to a New York Times reporter, Neil Sheehan. In a covert operation, the two set up a remote newsroom in a suite at the Hilton Hotel to avoid a potential FBI seizure at their home base. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times released the first of many brutal articles exposing the years of dishonesty encapsulated in the Pentagon Papers. The first article, titled Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement, was a shocking expose that many Americans took as something truthful, evidence of their predisposed understanding of an untruthful government. Later on, the New York Times released more shocking articles of the Pentagon study to the public. Additionally, 19 other news corporations became involved, such as the Washington Post. Richard Nixon became fearful as to how this media coverage would affect the relationship with the American people, for they failed in communicating authenticity with the citizens and sustaining a transparent bond with the public.
We've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
After the third article, the U.S. Department of Justice published a restraining order against further publication of the material, arguing that it was detrimental to U.S. national security. This led to an immediate case to the Supreme Court. Now known as New York Times versus the United States, the Times and the Washington Post joined forces to fight for the right to publish. On June 30th, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the government failed to prove harm to national security and that the publication of the papers was justified under the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press. Hugo Black wrote, "In revealing the workings of government that led to the Vietnam War, the newspapers nobly did that which the founders hoped and trusted they would do." The ruling was a landmark decision for press freedom. Although the publication of the papers was justified, Ellsberg's attainment of the documents was questionably lawful. On June 28, 1971, 2 days before the Supreme Court decision, he surrendered to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. Ellsberg reasoned that he could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public and that he was prepared to answer to all the consequences of this decision. Ellsberg was charged with conspiracy and violating the Espionage Act of 1917 and faced a maximum sentence of 115 years in prison. On June 3, 1973, the trial began and revealed that a secret Nixon White House team, dubbed the Plumbers, burglarized the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in September of 1971. These plumbers went on to become a part of Nixon's Watergate scandal in 1972. On May 11, 1973, Judge Byrne dismissed all charges against Ellsberg. From the end of the trial to this day, Ellsberg continues to spread the message of peace and freedom through speeches and public demonstrations.
Even months after the paper's initial release, broken connections of the people and government lingered. It took years of rebuilding trust and reliability for the people to have full confidence in their nation's leaders once again. The hidden documents disclose that under many administrations, the government withheld crucial information from the public, including expanding the war with the bombing of Cambodia and Laos, coastal raids on North Vietnam, and Marine Corps attacks, directly involving the United States in Vietnam, none of which have been reported by the American media. Additionally, the papers uncovered that under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the United States government played a direct role in the ultimate violation of the Geneva Accords in 1954, supporting South Vietnam and covertly undermining the communist country of North Vietnam. Not only did the Pentagon Papers affect the people, but it changed the government forever.
The Pentagon Papers were a new step toward breaking the barriers between the American government and what the public knew and understood, and probably did in itself lead to a new degree of skepticism about government pronouncements.
The Pentagon Papers not only broke barriers, but sparked progressive change in the future. This pattern of secrecy within the government later on became evident through the Afghanistan Papers as well. These constructed barriers proved that only slight change occurred since the Pentagon Papers scandal, and the government did not learn from their mistakes as they claimed they once did.
They are a reminder to the public to be skeptical about what governments tell us, whether in press conferences or news releases or speeches by politicians or senior military officials, because the Pentagon Papers stripped away the facade of, we have your best interests in mind, we're going to tell you the truth.
Furthermore, the full documents were not publicly available until certain classified portions were released in 2011 for the 40th anniversary of the paper's release. The history of events in the American military, society, and government created powerful barriers that the Pentagon Papers scandal worked to overcome and realize the change that needed to occur in the future. Barriers of government secrecy, manipulation, division, and distrust were built into the American society in the early 1960s. As the Pentagon Papers were released, the barriers came crashing down. Likewise, many presidents' reputations were altered as their secrets were brought to the public sphere. The Pentagon Papers scandal stripped the American people's trust held in their government and their nation's leaders. Furthermore, the barriers created and destroyed within this conflict remained for decades to come.